Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we are marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Well, this week we're going to jump straight into it. So, Richard, why don't you tell us what's piqued your interest this week?
Well, my matter of interest this week is rent controls, and it is inspired by the fact that this week we are seeing the implementation of the Renters' Rights Act of this Labour government. This is one of the flagship pieces of legislation of the government, and I think it will make an important impact into the private renters market in this country, which is full of various flaws and problems, which we might come on to. So just to give listeners an overview of the key provisions of this legislation, one of the things that this legislation does is that it ends fixed-term tenancies and makes tenancies open-ended, which means that if a tenant's circumstances change, let's say they get a job somewhere else, or let's say their family grows or shrinks, and let's say their partner leaves them, or let's say they have a child or something like that, their circumstances would be better served by going to a different property before the end of that fixed term. Now that problem no longer arises. They have a 2-month window to inform the landlord that they are planning to move out, and that's that. So they're not locked in for 6, 12, 24 months, whatever it might be. This also ends the no-fault evictions process that was brought in by Margaret Thatcher. We might talk about some of her changes in a moment. It limits rent increases to once a year, and tenants are now allowed to challenge these increases at a tribunal. Landlords must advertise the rent that they intend to charge. You can't advertise to say, I will charge a rent in excess of whatever, and then invite a bidding war among prospective renters who might say, well, I can pay 100 more a month if you give me the property. You know, whatever you advertise as the rent for that property is what you must charge. You cannot ask for more than 1 month's rent in advance. So sometimes landlords will ask for particular types of tenants. They might say, we need you to pay upfront 6 months. Or in a bidding war between prospective tenants, and this I think happens in London sometimes, a landlord might say, well, I will rent out to the person who can actually pay me upfront 6 months rent. And so people who have more money are going to be able to outbid those who have less money, even though they would still be able to afford the monthly rent if it was on a month-by-month basis. And this one I like in particular. Pets now can only be refused with cause. There is no blanket ban on pets. I was a victim of this when I was renting in Lancaster when I first took up my position as a lecturer. I had a hamster called Madonna, and my landlord banned pets. And I appealed to the letting agents and I said, look, she's got this discreet cage. She's very tidy. I clean her out very regularly. She wouldn't be any fuss or bother. She would live up in the converted loft, which I was using as my office in the property. And they said, nope, sorry, blanket rule, no pets, not even a hamster. It was an absurd situation, and I'm glad that the Labour government is removing that. And then finally, the government is explicitly prohibiting landlords from refusing to take people who are on benefits or people who have children. So I don't think this is going to solve all of the problems in the private rental market, but I think that it addresses some real unfairnesses that currently exist. It's obviously a bill that is more favourable to private renters than to landlords, but I feel that the level of imposition on landlords is fairly modest, and I think that what this could mean for the enhanced quality of life for renters is fairly significant. And so I think this is a good piece of legislation, even if it's not a perfect one or one that will fix all of the problems. However, given this is a history podcast, I thought it might be worth just reflecting for a moment on the broader history of government intervention into the private renters market. Earlier this week, it was rumoured that the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, might consider going further than the Renters' Rights Bill by imposing a 1-year rent freeze, preventing landlords from putting up rents for a year or longer to address the cost of living and the situation with inflation and so on. And there were a lot of people on X in particular, which is the sort of social media site that I've been grandfathered into. I joined Twitter back in 2009 and I'm still there. And a lot of people, particularly on the right, very angry about this. And so I just rather innocently posted saying that the right go apoplectic over the notion of rent freezes, but actually from World War One until the Thatcher government, for nearly all of that period, with one brief exception, Britain had rent controls and quite dramatic government intervention in the private renters market. And that post, which didn't even advocate for rent controls, it just pointed out that for most of the 20th century, Britain had rent controls, unleashed a fury of posters in response. I think I was what they call ratioed, where lots of people, many of them anonymous accounts of various levels of politeness, shall we say, responded to these people questioning my intelligence, people suggesting perhaps I shouldn't be an academic if I think these thoughts. I'm not really sure what thoughts they're concerned about. I mean, I was literally just reporting a historical fact. I suppose maybe that's beyond the pale for some people. But anyway, I just thought, given we have this podcast and given we have this matters of interest, I would meet my critics by actually maybe telling them a little bit more about that history. Again, not advocating one way or another particularly, but just to enhance the discussion perhaps with that deeper history. So anyone who was a child of Thatcher or later is unaccustomed with Britain having private rent controls because of her government's reforms. But rent controls were first brought in back in the First World War in Britain, when there were concerns that the crisis that the country was facing would cause landlords to basically exploit the crisis and put up rents at a time when, for example, construction might not be able to be directed as much to the construction of new properties due to the military situation, but would be directed to wartime means. The first bill on this was the Increase of Rent and Mortgage Interest War Restrictions Act 1915, which froze rents at pre-war levels. Now, some of these policies then ended up being preserved by the governments after the First World War. So one of the more significant of these is the Increase of Rent and Mortgage Interest Restrictions Act 1920, which limited the rate at which landlords could increase rents. In the Second World War, there were even more directive controls. But basically from 1915 until the mid-1950s, there was not a free market in the private rented sector by any stretch of the imagination. The government quite strongly restricted the ability of landlords to put up rents. This came to an end in 1957 under the government of Harold Macmillan in the Rent Act 1957. And the argument of the Conservative government at the time was that it was not attractive for more people to be private landlords, and so by removing the controls on rent, more people would become landlords, and this would open up the private rental stock. And that is obviously one of the main arguments that opponents of rent controls still today make. That legislation had quite dramatic but possibly unintended consequences, because the legislation said that if you were an existing tenant in a rent control property, then the previous arrangement remained in place, and so your landlord was still subject to rent controls. But landlords who rented to new tenants were no longer subjected to rent controls and could set whatever rates they wished. And what happened was some unscrupulous landlords took advantage of this, where they bought out, in some cases, their existing tenants, basically paid them to go, so that they could then rent out their properties at higher rates to new tenants. And the most unscrupulous of these were in parts of the country that were experiencing new migration from the Irish and also from Poles and, of course, from the Commonwealth, West Indians and South Asians. And the most infamous of these was a slum landlord, Peter Ruckman, who bought up these properties, many properties that were not well maintained, and then charged exorbitant rents to the immigrants who lived in them. And this man became so infamous that a whole practice known as Ruckmanism became a political issue in the early 1960s. And so when Labour came in 1964 under Harold Wilson, one of the main policies of that new Wilson government was to reintroduce rent controls. And the legislation that brought in rent controls was directed by the Housing Secretary at the time, Dick Crossman, who we've talked about a great deal because Crossman was a fairly colourful figure in the Wilson government and also wrote brilliant diaries about his time in politics. And this culminated in the Rent Act 1965. And it's a very important piece of legislation. It established a national policy of fair rents. That was the term that was used. It created a national rent system, which employed rent officers who valued what a fair rent for a property in a particular area might be, and they determined what rent landlords could charge on the basis of the location and quality of the property. So if you had a better maintained property, then the Rent Advisory Committee might allow you to charge a higher rent. So there was meant to be an incentive for maintaining higher quality properties if you wanted to charge higher rents. They were instructed not to take into account market pressures of supply and demand. They weren't there to say, well, if lots of people want to live in a particular area, then the rent should be higher. This was to try to not recreate that sort of system of scarcity which allows wealthier prospective tenants to outbid poorer tenants. There were some holes in the legislation. Furnished properties weren't covered in the same way as unfurnished properties and so on. And in 1977, the Callaghan government, on the Rent Act 1977, strengthened some of the provisions, including things like security of tenure. This rent service, this national rent system, was really quite interesting. It had lots of local assessors, and then there was a national rent assessment committee and a rent advisory board. And I learned recently that my grandfather was one of the local government representatives on the national rent advisory board. So was advising, at the time it was the Department of Environment in the 70s, which was had the housing ministry subsumed into it, that my grandfather was a Labour councillor, very interested in housing matters, advised the committee. And one of the other aspects of this was that both tenants and landlords could challenge the assessment of the rent that the rent control assessor determined. So if a landlord thought, actually, this rent is too low, and I think a fair rent would be a higher rent, that there was another body that they could go to appeal. And equally, as now with the new scheme under the Starmer government, tenants could also appeal and say, actually, I think the rent's too high. I think a fair rent is a lower rent, and you could have an independent assessment over that. And so that was the system that Wilson and Callaghan set up and pioneered, and then it was completely deconstructed by Margaret Thatcher with her Housing Act 1988, which basically completely removed rent controls, created a Wild West free market in the private rent system. I know there are regulations that applied, but it was much more of a Wild West than the previous system. And of course, this all sat alongside the fact 8 years earlier in 1980, the Thatcher government with the Housing Act had introduced right to buy, which allowed social housing tenants to own their properties. And in the immediate term, that was a transfer of social rent, which itself, of course, is effectively a form of rent control. The local government sets the rates that you would pay for your rent if you're on social rent, to home ownership. So it's not immediately has an impact on private ownership. But over time, right to buy properties would be, in many cases, transformed into rented properties, right? the person who bought the property might sell it on to someone who it would become a buy to let, or they themselves would move on to another property, and the property that they had bought under right to buy, they would become a landlord over. I think there were some restrictions over that, but over time, of course, many right to buy properties have become private rented properties. And so not only was Thatcher deregulating the private rental market, but was also shrinking the social rental market, and in the long term pushing more people from social rent to this unregulated private rent. So her reforms had a profound impact on the nature of housing in Britain. Some people argue for good reasons. Others would take a view that it's been a disaster. But that is the history. And just because we have lived since the late 1980s in this highly deregulated rental market does not mean that that is always the way it's been. It doesn't mean that it's some kind of wild or foreign idea to suggest rent controls in Britain. And for our parents' or grandparents' generation, it was a very normal part of the British housing system.
Gosh, well, there's a lot there. And to comment on it, I first of all wanted to zoom out ever so slightly to think about price controls at their broadest. So generally speaking, I'm pretty hostile to price controls and much more favour competition, as I think it's worth saying do most of us for the vast majority of things. There aren't many examples of products or services that people buy where people say the price for that should be set by the government or heavily regulated by the government. There are, of course, moments of time that would be exceptions to that, in war, for example. But generally speaking, in normal political and economic circumstances, I think price controls are generally a bad idea. But is housing an exceptional case? In principle, I think you could argue that housing may be an exceptional case for a few reasons. One of them is that there is limited supply because we have planning laws in this country, which, whilst they may be contentious, almost everybody believes there should be some form of planning law in this country. You may be at the more NIMBY or the more YIMBY end of the spectrum, but even the YIMBYest of YIMBYs still believes that there ought to be some form of regulation about where people can build. Nobody wants a tower block at the top of Helvellyn in the Lake District. Right? At least I don't think so, and if they do, they ought to give their head a wobble, in my view. So there's always going to be some restriction on supply, which of course is not necessarily the case for a lot of products that we may buy. If you go to the supermarket, etc., there is not artificial barriers that limit the supply of the goods that you may wish to buy. The second reason why housing may be an exceptional case is that it is a necessity, and it is something where most of us would say that where people cannot or do not provide housing for themselves, the state has an obligation to provide it for them. Either because there's a moral obligation to ensure that everybody is housed, I think that could be a compelling argument in and of itself, or because the costs of homelessness on society more broadly are enormous and socially catastrophic. So that is not something that we would want to see. So I do not rule out in principle that price controls can be suitable on some occasions, or that housing may be a market where you would want some form of price controls. The question, though, for me is, would regulating prices of the private rental market improve the quality of that market? And I do not think that it would, which is why fundamentally these are things that I would personally oppose. Primarily because I think it would have a negative impact on both the volume of homes available in the private rented market and also the quality of the homes available in the private rented market. For example, if you artificially cap or overly regulate what people can get for their home in the private rental market, then you incentivize them to sell and get out of that market altogether. I think that is a perfectly likely outcome. And even for those who stay in, you arguably disincentivize them from making improvements. Because basically if they were to, I don't know, put in new windows, do it the bathroom and all the rest of it, then they couldn't necessarily yield the reward for that in the market that they would otherwise would.
Got a couple of points in response to that. Similar points have been made to me this week on quality and on supply in particular. So first on the quality point, The idea here is that if you have a system of rent controls, there is no incentive for the landlord to enhance the quality of the property because they can't put up higher rents for investing in the property. But that is not my understanding of how the system of rent controls evolved under the Wilson-Callaghan years, because my understanding is that rent assessors were instructed to take into account the quality of the property when assessing the rental value of that property. And so you could potentially design a rent control system which did actually quite highly incentivize landlords if they wanted to put rents up to demonstrate that they had made improvements to the quality of the property in various ways. So I don't think that that is an unanswerable objection to rent controls.
No, but I think it is just worth saying that the answer to it in that system is an enormous bureaucracy where every property in the country that is being privately let out would have to be assessed by some sort of government regulator. So it's a big administrative jump to get from where we are now to get to there. We'd be talking about building an enormous apparatus.
For sure, but that, I mean, my original point is we used to do that. So we used to have that apparatus, and it's I think it's a public policy choice. I don't think it's beyond our capabilities as a country to do something that we were able to do 60 years ago. The second point on supply, this is the big one. A lot of people say, well, private renting collapsed in the post-war years. Well, it did as a percentage of housing stock because of the growth of social housing. So by the 1970s, nearly 1 in 3 households in Britain lived in a council house and social housing. Social housing was something that people of all different kinds of backgrounds lived in. Today, we often associate social housing with people who are in particular financial duress or difficult circumstances. But you had people who were middle-class people, lower middle-class people who lived in social housing. My father grew up in social housing and his father was a teacher. So it was something that was much more common. And as social housing grew as a percentage of the stock, the percentage of people living in private rented properties declined. And I don't think that's a bad thing, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Actually, the difference between now and then in terms of the share of people living in private rented properties is not that big. So today, 19% of people in Britain live in private rented properties. In the 1970s, at a time of rent controls and apparently no one wanting to be a private landlord, it was 15%. It's basically hardly changed. What has changed is there's been a massive decline of people living in social housing, going from about 30% in the 1970s to about 17% now. So it's about that is about halved in the last 50 years, whereas the proportion of people in private renting has gone up about 4 percentage points. And the real change actually is owner-occupiers. And that is partly a legacy of the right to buy, where a lot of that social housing stock became privately owned and people became homeowners for the first time, which is one of the arguments in favor of it. And we've talked about the right to buy in the past, and my grandfather was actually an advocate of a kind of Labour version of right to buy in the 1970s. So I don't think it's an inherently wicked policy. I think it was not designed in a way that was the most socially sensitive to its ramifications, but I don't think it's inherently nasty policy. But my point is, in answer to my many critics who ratioed me, that actually the share of people who are renting today privately is not very different from the share of people who rented privately back in the 1970s at the height of private rent controls in this country.
The other thing I wanted to come on to is the question of, to what extent ought we to regulate the private rental market more broadly? And this is something where there's clearly a balance to be struck. I mean, sometimes when people make a very free market case, and those arguments can sometimes be heard from more libertarian conservatives, for example, but it does come with challenges as well, and it particularly comes with challenges to the sort of society that we would want to see as conservatives in some respects. So let's say if you're in the old system, as the new Act, which comes in effect at the beginning of May, will do away with. Well, having a system whereby people do not necessarily have secure tenancies in the private rental market, say if you're a young family with children, can have really serious and negative effects. It could mean that you end up having to move away from where a child is at school to try and rent a new house. It could mean that you end up being pulled away from your social network and your family network of people who support you. So there are benefits, I think, to at the very least considering the way in which we regulate the housing market in order to try and make sure, yes, that it's something that isn't overly punitive towards landlords, but also that it isn't something which makes life harder and undesirable for the people who are renting. And then there are also just some ways in which we have regulated the markets in the past, which I think we would consider to be a great success. So one of those examples would be the deposit protection scheme. So when you are privately renting somewhere, your deposit gets protected and any deductions from it at the end of your tenancy have to be arbitrated. But my final point really, and this builds on one of the points that you made, Richard, is that if the government is looking at how to try and improve the situation for people who are renting rather than buying their home, then they have fundamentally levers of supply and demand that they can use. They can increase supply by encouraging more buy-to-let properties to come into the market. Whether you're YIMBY or NIMBY, one of the striking things about this government is that housing starts have not gone up. In fact, they're down on where they were when this government came into office. Housing starts in London have absolutely plummeted in recent years. This is a government that came into office pledging 1.5 million homes this parliament. Unless they start building them with cardboard next week, I mean, they're just not going to get them up in time based on where we're at the moment. But that is something that a government could do if they wanted to improve the market. They could encourage more supply of buy-to-let properties. They could also try and reduce demand for housing. I mean, of course, we have had very high, historically extraordinarily high levels of inward migration into the country in recent decades. Well, government could implement policies that would reduce demand on housing if they wanted to. And the third thing, and you mentioned this yourself, Richard, is that they could invest much more in social housing. If the government believes that rent controls are a good idea, well, rent controls exist in social housing because of the nature of it being, to some degree, state-provided housing, albeit often now through housing associations or otherwise. And well, if the government thinks that there is a shortfall of affordable housing that the private sector isn't providing, they face a choice from either trying to regulate that private sector, which will have all these adverse consequences, many of which we've discussed and your critics have pronounced against you, or the government could actually create some of the market that it wants to see itself through social housing. And that really is where I think governments would be much better advised to focus their energies and their attention than if they get the idea in their head from you or elsewhere to try and roll back the clock to the 1970s and a much more tightly regulated housing market.
I agree that there are interventions government can make that could adjust the supply and demand factor outside of the question of controls. And I am someone on the left, but I very much take the view that it is foolish to pretend that the unprecedentedly high levels of net migration that we've seen into Britain in the last 20 years has not placed demands on the housing stock, particularly in certain cities in Britain, including London, but other urban parts of the country, where people who have immigrated to this country looking for work in many cases are going to where the jobs are, and that puts higher demand on the housing stock. I mean, it's just obvious, and it's ridiculous to, I think, pretend otherwise. And I agree. I think if you're going to have high levels of immigration, then you ought to have put in the infrastructure for that, and successive governments have failed to do that, and therefore the levels that they allowed into this country were, in my view, irresponsible. I also support increasing supply through social housing, and here's my trade-off with the critics. I'd say, look, I'd be willing to go lighter on the private rental market regulation if there is more willingness to reopen the question of the expansion of the social housing market. And also, I think, to make social housing more like what it once was, which is that it was a choice that people who often were young families starting off in life, could make a decision about, do I want to put my name down on the list for a council house? And that's something that I can do. If I want to move to buy my own property later down the line, I can do so, but it can help me get my first start in life, start a family. What happened was, in the 1970s under the Callaghan government, social housing, which had previously been, as far as I understand, was basically a system of, you put your name down on the list where you were from, and eventually, when your number was called up, so to speak, you would be allocated a property. It became much more about allocation prioritization on need and different scorings that people would get. And if you didn't match a variety of criteria of need, then the likelihood that you would ever get council housing was so low that people came to see council housing as basically something that only people who had particular additional needs would qualify for. And that, I think, is understandable in one sense, but in the longest run, public support for social housing, I don't think it's been a good thing, because I think that it means that people see social housing as something that's not for them or for their children, but is for people who are really struggling. And they then may evaluate social housing on the basis of almost like a charitable notion, rather than seeing this as an alternative way of organizing the housing market. Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
Well, this week I wanted to talk about the King's speech, not the speech on the throne that we're going to get shortly after the local elections, nor the speech that he made this week to a joint session of the US Congress, but his speech from the crossbenchers of the House of Lords in June 1974. This was something I came across this week when I discovered that the Parliament website, which has profiles for former and current MPs and peers, also has a page for His Majesty the King, for when he was Prince of Wales and a member of the House of Lords from the 1970s until 1999, when he was one of the hereditary peers kicked out by Tony Blair's House of Lords reforms. Now, it is worth saying that members of the royal family were not active, certainly not typically active members of the House of Lords. And when the now King, as Prince of Wales, spoke in June 1974, it was the first time since 1884 that a Prince of Wales had spoken in the Lords. That was then the future Edward VII, who spoke on the challenges of housing, very much related to the first part of this podcast, in particular for people who are poor. Although Edward VII did attend the House of Lords fairly regularly, but spoke very rarely to try and keep himself above the political fray, rather on the theme of our last main podcast too. But when the Prince of Wales, Charles, went to speak, he went to speak on the theme of a particular select committee report on sport and recreation, and in part on young people. Obviously, he was himself pretty young at the time, and has done a lot of work with the Prince's Trust, which is now the King's Trust, which has been one of the great vocations, really, of his life. And there were a couple of things that I spotted about this speech that the King made, which I wanted to point out. One of them was about who else was there from the royal family. So the Duke of Kent, still alive, in his 10th decade. He was there and sat next to him on the crossbenches. His uncle, Lord Snowdon, the husband of the Princess Margaret, he was there as well. Princess Margaret herself stayed up in the gallery. The chamber was absolutely packed, and peers seemed to perk up at the moment that the Prince of Wales began to speak. In fact, the Liverpool Daily Post said this about Lord Hailsham, who's appeared on this podcast. Well, not appeared, but who has been spoken about on this podcast many times before. Miraculously, Lord Hailsham's internal alarm woke him at 3:34 p.m, just as the Prince of Wales rose to make his maiden speech. His lordship, on the opposition front bench, of course 74 is the year of 2 elections, and Lord Hailsham would have been on the government front bench until the February election that kicked Edward Heath out of government and brought Harold Wilson back in. His lordship on the opposition front bench had been in one of those ostentatious slumbers that parliamentary old hands are expected to indulge in. But the minute Viscount Cobham had finished his opening address in the Lords' debates on sport and leisure, Lord Hailsham was upright and turning bright eyes towards the Prince. For it's not every day that the Prince of Wales makes his maiden speech in the House. On the theme of what did the king say himself, well, the first thing he did is, because this was his maiden speech, he gave the oath of allegiance to his own mother that enabled him to be admitted properly as a member of the Lords. And then he began what were his about 17-minute remarks. He began by saying how he was speaking with some degree of fear and trembling, and spoke about other times when members of the royal family had spoken in the Lords more acrimoniously than he was going to. And then he turned in particular to his theme about leisure and recreation, and made it clear that, quote, there is inevitably a danger here of finding ourselves trying to tell people how their leisure time should be spent. This is not the object at all. But I do believe that if leisure time is employed antisocially by some people, it is therefore well worth trying to channel that antisocial recreation into more healthy pastimes. One way of doing that must be by providing better and more planned facilities. He spoke about the benefits of urban parks and recreation areas, as well as the countryside, and made comparisons with, quote, our neighbours across the Channel, especially in Holland, who have been planning and coordinating their leisure facilities, whilst we have continued somewhat haphazardly. At times, the now king was fairly bold in his suggestions. He said he entirely supported the committee's recommendations that the government should develop a central impetus to encourage local government to promote recreational facilities and recreation departments. He even seemed to make a bit of a suggestion for Harold Wilson for the next government reshuffle, and said, quote, I believe that the Welsh office and the Scottish office already have recreation sections of their own and can therefore help to coordinate the various opinions by bringing all the different bodies together. So far as England is concerned, if we have to bring nationalism into it, I should have thought that the present Minister for Sport could quite easily become the Minister for Recreation or the Minister for Leisure, which would be a far more apt title. It is a suggestion, though, that I'm afraid was not taken up. The king also spoke a little bit about how he thinks what we may call the little platoons of society, the sort of people who often keep leisure and recreation going, ought to operate and what their relationship to the state ought to be. He said, quote, I believe very strongly that the last thing one should do is make any of these recommendations compulsory, not anyway until it seems absolutely necessary. One of the great traditions of this country has been the comparative freedom with which organisations and societies have been able to operate, and this is an essential tradition of civilised, intelligent living, which must be preserved at all costs. And he suggested that these freer societies could even be exempt from forms of taxation and rates of all kinds, before summing up that he was there to support their ambition, to take on, quote, the challenge of removing the dead hand of boredom and frustration from mankind. I found this really interesting for a few points. One of them is that it's very easy now to forget that members of the royal family would occasionally, from time to time, make contributions in the House of Lords. And there's a set of questions around when it would be appropriate to do so, both in terms of frequency and also in terms of subject. Secondly, having read the speech, I mean, it really does go to the heart of some of the things that really matter to the king. Yes, about young people, but also about this sense of the outdoors and about having activity and things to do in life. And he references quite often throughout the speech books that he's read on this theme and about the perils of boredom almost in a civilized and fairly prosperous society. And thirdly, it also gave me cause to expand that tentative topology that we discussed in the last episode of ways in which monarchs or members of the royal family could be political. Because one of them that we didn't discuss, but which I think is legitimate, is that the monarch can occasionally give people cause to focus on issues that might otherwise be overlooked or not necessarily get a great deal of attention. Certainly on this occasion, a select committee report on sport and recreation ended up seeing a packed House of Lords with lots of journalists in there to listen and being written about in every newspaper in the country and indeed many newspapers across the world. So there was a chance for the king to say, this is an issue that matters to me, and to try and make it matter to more people too.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Lee. I did not know about the King's speech or the Prince of Wales' speech in the House of Lords back in 1974. And it was really interesting to hear what he focused on. And you can see it's very much a speech of now the king, of Prince Charles, really, in the content, tone, and manner of the speech. What it made me think about was the unique value of the House of Lords, which has been stripped down increasingly in the last 30 years. But it's really an extraordinary chamber, almost like none else in the world. And for some commentators, the fact of its uniqueness is therefore a reason to reform it, to make it look more like other upper chambers. But I think very much the argument goes in the other direction. I mean, you think about this. We don't have in Britain this kind of strict separation of powers that defines many other constitutional systems. And the House of Lords was really the culmination of that way in which the different branches of government were overlapping and sitting together. You had in the House of Lords the most senior members of the judiciary. You had the Church of England, the established church, the bishops represented there. You had the heir to the throne and the royal dukes in there. And you had members of the government of the day, of the sitting cabinet, who were also in there. And you think about the types of people who would have been in that chamber then, and still many of those types of people now. People who were business leaders, but also trade union leaders, former prime ministers, former cabinet ministers, current cabinet ministers, future cabinet ministers, scientists, doctors, writers, playwrights, historians, constitutional experts, leading figures from the military, environmentalists, etc., etc. And they're all gathered together in this chamber, and they are debating important matters of state. And because none of them have a democratic mandate to be there, they ultimately know that they have to bow, even the royal dukes, to the will of the House of Commons. And the members of the royal family in particular who were sitting in the House of Lords knew they had to be extremely careful and judicious in the interventions they made. But that also speaks to another part of the House of Lords, which I think is really important, but many reformers are trying to destroy, which is its part-time nature. I think one of the great things about the House of Lords is that members of the House of Lords should not be required to be there all the time, to speak on every matter, and to behave like a normal politician in the House of Commons, treating it as MPs have now come to treat their jobs as if it was some kind of full-time profession. There are, of course, some peers who are there a lot, but there are others who come infrequently. And I think these requirements on peers to present themselves in the House of Lords a minimum number of times or else they lose their position in the House of Lords is very pernicious, because I wouldn't want the Prince of Wales to feel that he has to attend debates frequently. But I wouldn't say that I think it's a bad thing that on occasion, maybe it's once in every decade, maybe it's once every 100 years, as it seemed to be in this particular case almost, that someone who is a member of the House of Lords could make an intervention on a matter of serious importance, and that the chamber could be filled with people from all these different walks of life, people who are political and non-political, people who are experienced, people who are expert, coming together. And so the efforts to make this into an elected upper chamber or a representative upper chamber or some kind of upper chamber that looks like other upper chambers, I think defeats the value of the House of Lords. And to be honest, in my view, if that's the way that you're going to go, then get rid of the thing entirely and just have a unicameral parliament. That would be my preference, rather than having some kind of duplicate chamber of politicians, as I think many advocates of House of Lords reform want to see.
Well, constitutional politics is something of a dance, really. That cannot always easily be predicted or too stringently regulated, because you have these different moving parts with different obligations and duties and mandates and privileges and burdens. And the House of Lords has often been, historically, the place where they would meet. And certainly the bits that had the lesser mandate, but sometimes the greater dignity, in an old sense of that term. And I think that did bring value. And I think it does still have the potential to bring value mean, on several of these things, the ship has really left the port. So, for example, the present Prince of Wales is not about to make a speech in the House of Lords because he's no longer entitled to membership since 1999. But there are still benefits that the Lords can bring. For example, if you take the view, and many people do take the view, that the House of Commons and the membership of the House of Commons leave something to be desired. That's not a criticism of any individual MP for what it's worth. All of the individual MPs could be superb people. But if it was the case that they were too similar in background or experience or outlook about how government works, then all those superb people could in fact be, as a mass of legislators, lacking something really quite important. And for a political class that desires and respects diversity of thought and background and interest and experience, then the House of Lords remains a place where you can put people who have those more divergent backgrounds. And in fact, in many ways is, the founder of the Big Issue is there and sits near the Archbishop of Canterbury, well, certainly not too far away. That is in many ways a very useful thing to have and does bring a sense of colour and diversity, which is actually very hard to generate in a chamber like the House of Commons, but can still be brought about in the Lords. And this was, I think, a moment in June 1974 when a bit of purple, regal purple, entered that picture.
And can I just reflect on the value, perhaps, in particular, of having the heir to the throne as a member of the House of Lords? I like the idea that the Prince of Wales in the 19th century, the future Edward VII, attended the House of Lords frequently but spoke rarely. I think that's quite a good idea because it's a place where the future head of state can learn about the affairs of the country, can learn about how legislation is made, can learn something of the personalities of politics, can gain from the experience of the more senior members of the House of Lords. Of course, the House of Lords does skew, especially these days, to an older generation. And the head of state may long outlive some of the voices that they are hearing in the House of Lords when they are, say, a younger heir, as Charles III was in the 1970s. And to me, this is just another example of how, a rather unusual and eccentric arrangement actually added value to the governance of this country. And by removing it and making it less eccentric, you've done nothing of add value to the governance of this country, and all you've done is detract from it.
Well, that's all for this midweek episode of Since Attlee Churchill. We'll be back on Sunday, when we'll be discussing the 1968 local elections, which were a catastrophic battering at the polls for Harold Wilson and his Labour government. And we'll be discussing that just a few days before we find out if Keir Starmer is about to suffer a similar fate. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.